This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Jill Newbron, and here are tonight's top stories. South Korea and France have upgraded ties to a global strategic partnership as leaders agree to work towards the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and de-escalate Middle East tensions. The U.S. strikes a key bridge in Iran, killing at least 8 as Tehran warns against provocations ahead of an expected UN Security Council vote on authorizing force to protect shipping along the paralyzed waterway. China hits back at U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, calling Beijing a bully over what Washington says is the holding up of Panama-flagged ships, dismissing his remarks as groundless. A former Myanmar military chief, Min Aung Hlaing, has been elected as the country's new president. Beijing says it is ready to work with the new government to further develop ties. Also tonight, India's textile sector feeling the strain as uncertainty clouds business outlook in the US. Now some are turning to more stable markets like Japan. Plus, China dominates the global electric vehicle market, producing millions of cars every year. But there aren't enough skilled workers to service and maintain them. We shine a spotlight on the hidden figures supporting the country's EV boom. South Korea and France have agreed to elevate ties to a global strategic partnership, marking a major upgrade in relations between the two countries. Both sides aim to boost bilateral trade to a record $20 billion by 2030, up from the $15 billion currently. Our senior correspondent, Lee Mung-suk, with this report.
A warm state welcome at the presidential Blue House as French President Emmanuel Macron arrived for his summit meeting with President Lee Jae-myung. Following that meeting, the two leaders met with the press, with both leaders agreeing that at the heart of their talks on Friday morning was the Middle East crisis and the need to keep critical energy routes open, including the Strait of Hormuz. They said they agreed to coordinate closely on stabilizing global energy flows and reducing economic uncertainty.
Nous avons abordé la crise au Moyen-Orient, les conditions d'un processus de désescalade et les conditions dans un cadre international clairement établi, une déconfliction étant négociée avec l'Iran, d'une réouverture du détroit d'Ormuz. Nous avons également défendu la paix juste et durable et le respect du droit international, et je veux dire notre convergence de vues, qu'il s'agisse de l'Ukraine face à la guerre d'agression russe, ou qu'il s'agisse aussi de la paix et de la stabilité dans la péninsule coréenne. C'est la même vision que nous défendons. Celle de respect du droit international, d'une paix durable et des garanties qui vont avec.
President Lee also said the two countries will work together to respond to global economic and energy shocks while strengthening cooperation in key sectors.
중동 전쟁이 야기한 경제 및 에너지 위기에 공동 대응하고자 정책 경험과 전략을 공유하고 글로벌 경제의 불확실성 해소를 위해 함께 노력하기로 하였습니다. 원자력 및 해상 풍력 분야의 협력을 확대하여 에너지 안보를 강화하는 한편으로 호르무즈 해협 내 안전한 해상 수송로 확보를 위해 협력하겠다는 의지도 확인하였습니다.
The summit also marked a major step forward, with both countries agreeing to expand trade and investment, strengthen supply chains, and deepen cooperation in future industries like AI, semiconductors, and nuclear energy. There were also concrete outcomes, with 3 revised agreements and 11 memorandums of understanding signed, aimed at strengthening supply chains and cooperation in future industries like AI, semiconductors, and nuclear energy. This is the first visit to South Korea by a sitting French president in more than a decade and comes at a time of rising global uncertainty. As Seoul and Paris mark 140 years of diplomatic ties, both sides signaling their partnership is no longer just symbolic, but increasingly strategic and global in scope. Im Yan-suk, CNA, Seoul.
And you could get insights on what can Japan and South Korea make of the French leader's visit a little later in the hour. I'll be speaking with Stephen Nagy, Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. Iran has warned against what it calls provocative action ahead of a delayed UN Security Council vote on a draft resolution seeking to authorize the use of force to protect shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran says any such moves could complicate the situation in one of the world's most critical oil transit routes. Meanwhile, Gulf states, led by Bahrain, pushed the measure which would allow countries to take defensive action to keep the vital waterway open.
ونحن واثقون من أن مشروع القرار ينسجم مع القانون الدولي ومع أحكام اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لقانون البحار التي نظمت حق السفن في المرور العابر في المضائق الذي لا يجوز أن يعاق كما تفعل إيران اليوم.
The proposal faces opposition from China, Russia and France, which holds veto powers. Beijing's UN envoy warned of a potential escalation if the Council approves the resolution.
安理会承担着维护国际和平与安全的首要职责，应该秉持客观、公正和公平的立场。当前形势下，授权会员国使用武力，无异于将非法滥用武力的行径合法化，势必引发局势进一步升级，造成严重后果。
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi earlier echoed this sentiment. He said the UNSC must not legitimize unauthorized military action. Chinese state media reported that he called the US and Israeli attacks on Iran a violation of international law. Mr. Wang has held calls with his EU, German, as well as Saudi counterparts. Well, President Donald Trump has vowed more attacks on Iran after the US struck a major bridge in the country. Mr. Trump calling on Tehran to make a deal, quote, before it's too late. Iranian state media say at least 8 people were killed and 95 wounded. Footage on social media showing the strike and collapse of the B1 bridge. Mr. Trump shared the video on Truth Social. The bridge, recognized as the tallest in the Middle East, is a key transportation link for Tehran and the northern provinces. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on X that strikes on civilian structures would not force their surrender. China also weighing in on the strike, the Foreign Ministry stressing that it opposes attacks on civilian facilities and urged for an immediate ceasefire and return to diplomacy. Tehran had warned of a broader retaliation. The military said the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed to the US and its allies after President Trump called on nations to head to the waterway to secure their oil. Diplomatic efforts ongoing. The UK on Thursday led a meeting with dozens of countries without the US as they sought ways to resume traffic on the strait. So major Asian economies such as China, Japan, South Korea, they're all bearing the brunt of the global oil supply shock because they depend heavily on the Middle East. Around 60% of its oil comes from the region. So what's the alternative? Well, here's what Donald Trump is proposing.
I have a suggestion. Number one, buy oil from the United States of America. We have plenty. We have so much.
But switching isn't so simple. Asian refiners have limited options to diversify for many reasons. First, the type of crude. Now, the U.S. and Middle Eastern oil, they're different. Many Asian refineries are built specifically to process Middle Eastern grades. Retooling them could cost billions of dollars. Second, distance and logistics. Now, oil from the Middle East can reach Asia in about 25 days via the Strait of Hormuz, according to shipping industry estimates. In contrast, shipments from the U.S. Gulf Coast that cross the Atlantic sail around southern Africa and into the Indian Ocean, and that can take up to 2 months, adding to the costs. third, long-term contracts. Many countries are locked into multi-year deals with Middle Eastern suppliers, now some of which even own stakes in Asian refineries, and that makes switching suppliers more difficult. Well, the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer, with an output averaging 13 million barrels a day, but it also consumes far more than it exports, about 20 million barrels a day, limiting how much supply is available. So Asia's reliance isn't just habit, it comes down to cost, infrastructure, geography. Even with more U.S. oil on the market, shifting away from the Middle East will take time. And we have more coverage on the energy fallout surrounding the Iran war, including this piece on how the conflict might reshape Asia's playbook. And you can head over to our website, cna.asia. You may also follow the latest on our mobile app. The United States has accused China of using economic pressure following a spike in detentions or holdups of Panama-flagged ships in Chinese ports. Data from Tokyo MOU, a regional port state control organization, shows out of some 120 ships detained in Chinese ports in March, 92, or about 75%, were Panama-flagged. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the actions raise serious concerns and suggest that they appear linked to a Panamanian court ruling against Hong Kong-based port operator C.K. Hutchison. Panama's Supreme Court in January struck down the legal basis for C.K. Hutchison's concession to run two key ports at either end of the Panama Canal. That development came amid growing U.S. pressure on Panama to curb Chinese influence around the strategic waterway, which handles around 5% of global maritime trade. Now, China said Mr. Rubio's remarks were completely fabricated and a distortion of the truth.
美方一再说三道四，只能暴露自身霸占运河的图谋。究竟是谁公然通过单边霸凌和胁迫破坏巴拿马运河的中立地位，破坏全球供应链的稳定？公道自在人心。中方在巴拿马有关港口问题上的立场是明确的，将坚定维护自身的正当权益。
C.K. Hutchison has rejected the court ruling and accused Panama of unlawfully seizing its assets. The port operator launched an international arbitration case against the country, seeking more than $2 billion in damages. Coming up in East Asia tonight, South Korea says the new metal tariff system by the U.S. could ease the burden on exporters, but some products still face tariffs of up to 50%. Welcome back. It's Friday, and that means Olivia Mazuki is joining us for the business news. Liv, now, it's been a year since Trump passed his Liberation Day tariffs, and now Washington is trying to simplify its metal tariffs. What do Asian exporters think about that?
Well, Jill, it's quite a mixed bag with, some saying it's a relief, but it's uncertainty for others, with many manufacturers still working through what the new rules actually mean. For South Korea, the Trade Ministry says that the White House new simplified metal tariff regime will likely ease the burden on its companies when calculating duties. But the country's appliance makers say they're still assessing the impact. And the revision came after American businesses raised concerns about the complex calculations to determine the cost of levies. The system had required firms to calculate the value and origin of all metals in a product, including small bits such as screws. Now, under the revised measure, items with metal content of 15% or less by weight will be exempt from tariffs. Products with a higher metal content will face a 25% tariff, and the 50% levy will remain on raw materials or goods made almost entirely of aluminium, steel, or copper. But its calculation has changed. The rate on those metals will be based on the price paid by U.S. imports. Officials say that the change was made to prevent foreign sellers from undervaluing their products to pay less in tariffs.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
1 year on, is America wealthy again? Well, this time last year, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on imports from more than 60 countries, with especially steep duties on China. Markets plunged, forcing a partial rollback within weeks, but the damage was already done. Businesses face rising costs and uncertainty, while consumers saw higher prices. Now, countries scrambled to make deals with the U.S., although in most cases, they only offered limited relief. A major turning point came this year. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down tariffs the Trump administration implemented under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, saying it had overstepped its legal authority. The move could trigger up to $150 billion in refunds, although it may take months or even years for businesses to actually get their money back in what's been deemed a complex process. The U.S. president then pivoted quickly to replace those Liberation Day tariffs with a temporary 10% global import duty for 150 days under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, after which Congress would need to approve their extension. At the same time, Mr. Trump has ordered new investigations under other laws that could allow him to reimpose the tariffs. So where do things stand right now? Well, tariffs did shrink the U.S. trade deficit with China, but America's overall deficit widened due to trade diversion. Domestically, U.S. manufacturing jobs declined. Some sectors did see some gains, although it may not necessarily have been tied to the tariffs. Now, American consumers continue to grapple with inflation and small businesses taking a massive blow. Southeast Asian economies were among the hardest hit by the Trump tariffs, but the region has weathered the shock for now, helped by temporary buffers such as front-loaded shipments, delayed duties, and targeted sector exemptions. And global supply chains have been permanently reshaped with decades of free trade and multilateral norms no more. Earlier, CNA spoke with Jeff Moon, president of China Moon Strategies and former assistant U.S. trade rep for China Affairs. He explains the payoffs and pitfalls of Mr. Trump's tariff moves over the past year.
Well, the results are mixed. On the upside, the Trump administration would say that using the leverage of these tariffs, they've negotiated trade deals with 20 countries. Many of those countries reduced tariffs for U.S. goods, and many also have increased foreign investment into the United States. But few of those deals are finalized and actually legally binding, and so there are ongoing discussions. The downside of all of this, of course, is that the aggressive attitude that the Trump administration has had has really challenged America's alliances overseas. It's undermined trust and increased suspicion of U.S. intentions. You know, as I look ahead, I have sort of a sense of deja vu. A year ago, Trump's tariffs were declared, suspended, negotiated, litigated, and then declared unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court has sent us back basically to square one, where Trump is now going to repeat the same cycle with a new round of tariffs, complete with the chaos that we saw over the past year.
Indian officials say a trade deal with the U.S. will only be signed after Washington finalizes its own tariff structure. The uncertainty is affecting the Indian textile sector, with exporters now looking to more stable markets in Asia. Neha Punia filed this report for CNA from New Delhi.
आज की तारीख में यूएसए के साथ काम करना तो impossible है.
Lalit Tukral heads a consortium of apparel exporters located outside New Delhi. For decades, factories like his supplied garments to the US, India's largest export market for textiles. But then came President Trump's 50% tariffs last year, and now uncertainty over the trade pact. A US probe into excess industrial capacity from countries, including India, has further frayed expectations of a recovery.
हमें उम्मीद तो बहुत थी कि ये हो जाएगा, इंटरम डील के अंदर भी लग रहा था कि ये भी अच्छा हो जाएगा, ठीक है। अब लेकिन ये वॉर जो फिर हो गई है और इसमें ऑल अमेरिका इज इन्वॉल्व एवरीवेयर, तो अब हमें समझ नहीं आ रही कि इसका असर क्या होगा, कोई हम कैलकुलेशन करने के काबिल ही नहीं रहे।
New Delhi and Washington have not held substantive talks since the US Supreme Court invalidated President Trump's tariffs in February. It remains unclear when or even if a deal will be signed. This uncertainty is weighing heavily on the textile sector, which employs 45 million people across India. Manufacturers say US buyers are either withholding orders or pushing for steep discounts, and now with the war on Iran, rising raw material and shipping costs are further squeezing margins. On factory floors, impacted companies say they are cutting production and in some cases laying off workers. Traders are now looking beyond the US towards more predictable markets like Japan.
मालूम नहीं कल क्या होगा, कल फिर कोई टैरिफ लगा दे, तो अब लोगों ने जापान की तरफ डाइवर्शन किया। जापान में अच्छी क्वालिटी जा रही है, अच्छा काम कर रहे हैं वो लोग। अभी हम जब वहाँ फेयर होता है तो 200-250 लोग जाते हैं फेयर पे।
India is one of the world's largest textile and apparel exporters, but its shipments to Japan make up less than 1% of Tokyo's $30 billion textile imports. Businessmen like Mukesh Kinchi say this market holds immense potential for Indian traders if they can meet its requirements.
Because it's not an easy market to be into, because the quality standards are quite high vis-a-vis the European or the American market. So it took us almost like 2 years to get initial breakthroughs.
His company has been shipping to Japan since 2016, tailoring products to local preferences.
But Japan is something more product conscious market, where along with the price and other thing, you need to offer a solution, and you need to make a product which is more durable and more long lasting with a higher performance.
New Delhi already has an economic pact with Tokyo, which exporters say makes it easier to operate there. But analysts warn that export volumes to Japan will never come close to the demand seen in the US, which is why it's crucial businesses stop relying on large-scale exports to just one country. The Indian government is also pushing businesses to diversify their trade, having recently signed pacts with the EU and the United Kingdom. Some experts, however, say the government needs to go a step further.
We haven't been able to create something like wow for Indian textile and apparel. And I think that's the way we should move forward. The ministry needs to move forward with a target, with a vision plan, and with an action document for that vision plan.
Businesses say America's shifting trade dynamics and now the Middle East conflict are reshaping India's textile industry, making it that much harder to pin down new business. To stay competitive, exporters say they will need to adapt quickly and find new opportunities in markets closer to home. For CNE, I'm Neha Punya in New Delhi.
Japanese authorities are growing more concerned about sharp moves in the yen as volatility picks up again. Finance Minister Satsuki Katayama says tensions in the Middle East have added to the swings seen across global markets, with speculation rising in both oil and currencies. She says officials are watching closely and stand ready to act if needed. The remarks come as the yen sits near levels that have triggered intervention before. Tokyo aims to keep excessive currency moves from hurting the economy and pushing up prices for consumers. South Korea has issued a similar warning on speculative moves in its currency. Authorities have promised stern actions against spreading misinformation and other malicious activities aimed at taking advantage of market volatility. The remarks came a day after the finance minister filed a complaint against a report about possible government action due to the war on Iran. The report is alleging that citizens will be asked to sell their US dollar holdings and transfer the proceeds to the state. The Korean won has been volatile since fighting in the Gulf drove up global oil prices and triggered worries about energy supply as well as economic slowdown. Microsoft says it is planning to invest $10 billion in Japan over the next 3 years on AI infrastructure and cybersecurity. The software giant says the plans include training 1 million engineers and developers by the end of this decade. Microsoft says it will work with SoftBank and other local companies to expand Japan's AI capabilities. The plan was unveiled today during a meeting between Microsoft President Brad Smith and Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. Microsoft joins other American tech giants who have announced large-scale investments in Japan. Oracle said it would invest $8 billion in the country in 2024. And in the same year, Amazon also said it planned to invest $15 billion. And that's all I have for you, Jill. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. I was just going to say that too. Thanks so much, Liv. Now, coming up on East Asia tonight, France elevates ties with Japan and South Korea as President Emmanuel Macron makes an eastward diplomatic blitz amid geopolitical uncertainties and an expanding energy crisis. We'll speak to Stephen Nagy for more insights on whether Mr. Macron will reap the outcomes Paris sees. And Cambodia approves a sweeping new law targeting cybercrime as the country moves to crack down on the multi-billion-dollar scam industry. This is East Asia Tonight. These are the headlines we're following. Iran cautions against provocations ahead of an expected UN Security Council vote on authorizing force to protect shipping along the Strait of Hormuz. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, warning of more attacks on Iran after the U.S. struck a key Iranian bridge, killing at least 8. China accuses the U.S. of fabricating claims that Beijing had detained Panama-flagged ships, dismissing remarks made by Secretary of State Marco Rubio as groundless. And France and South Korea upgrading ties to a global strategic partnership. Both sides work to mitigate economic uncertainty. Presidents Emmanuel Macron and counterpart Lee Jae-myung also agreeing to work towards the reopening of the vital Strait of Hormuz and de-escalate tensions in the Middle East. The agreements come after Donald Trump slammed allies for not contributing to the war on Iran. Mr. Macron, after visiting Japan, is in South Korea for a 2-day state visit, the first by a French president in 11 years. We're staying on that story, and we're joined by Stephen Nagy, Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. He's coming to us live from Budapest. Professor Nagy, welcome. Look, what is the real strategic takeaway from Macron's trip to Japan and South Korea? Are we looking at meaningful gains, whether it be security or trade, or largely symbolic?
So from my standpoint, I think that all the players in the puzzle are looking to find ways to pressure the United States. The view is that for Francois Macron coming to both South Korea and Japan, he's looking to find new partners that may help him bridge the divide between France and the United States, but also the EU and the United States. For Japan and South Korea, I think their puzzle is a little bit more complicated in that they want to strengthen their relationship with the United States by pulling in other partners and using them to demonstrate to the United States that they're looking elsewhere and that they're telling the United States that, you know, they're moving towards a position where they may rebalance the relationship with the United States. At the same time, I think it's important for us to understand both South Korea and Japan have a security partnership with the United States. It's an alliance. Both are more than 70 years old. And these are the bedrock, the cornerstone of their security within the region, and this won't change. And that no matter how much the French and President Macron comes to the region, really it's not going to change that calculus.
Interesting. I want to pick up on a couple of points that you mentioned. Firstly, that they're pressuring the US, and I think Macron is pitching Europe as that steady partner. So are Tokyo and Japan buying into it? Because as you said, the bedrock of their relationship is with the US as well. So is there an option for them to hedge bets?
I just don't think there is. Without the United States, South Korea will have a huge problem in terms of dealing with North Korea. And of course, Japan depends on the United States for balancing China so that it can engage with China and engage and enjoy the economic opportunities that come from that relationship. from a position of strength. That's not going to change. And what we've seen over the past 2 years, in particular since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is that the global geopolitical situation is becoming more complex. Russia and North Korea are collaborating on missile development, satellite technology, and perhaps weapons of mass destruction. China and Russia are collaborating indirectly through third countries where China is supporting Russia's war effort in Ukraine. We've seen the attacks on Iran. It's a complicated world, and from Tokyo and South Korea's perspective, they demand the United States to be in the region, and not in terms of forcing them, but they need the United States in the region to deal with all these challenges that are becoming more complex, putting downward pressures on their economy, and creating security anxieties in both capitals. France and the EU are not stable partners. They have problems in their own backyard, and they haven't been able to solve those problems.
Okay, so what does France realistically offer? Let's start with Seoul in terms of its priorities right now. Where does it fit in?
So I think that Seoul is looking for a broader partnership globally in terms of trade and the economy. It's looking for different kinds of security partnerships so that it can perhaps strengthen its deterrence capabilities vis-a-vis North Korea. But South Korea is also looking towards the unorthodox policies within the White House and a strengthening assertive behavior from Beijing and saying, well, we need to develop new partners, new strategic partnerships, and the term that they use is the global strategic partnership to try and deal with these increasingly difficult challenges. And it's a little bit like the Cold War in that, South Korea and Japan both were pushed together to deal with the challenges of the Soviet Union and the United States. And what we're seeing now is a growing number of countries being pushed together to deal with not only unorthodoxy and assertive behavior from Beijing, but the same from the White House under Donald Trump. And this is creating new coalitions to try and deal with these challenges and build a critical mass of countries that can perhaps resist some of these unorthodox policies, transactional diplomacy, and economic coercion that's coming from all directions.
Interesting that. As the war started in Iran, East Asia did make a point of telling the US, hey, don't ignore us, maintain your focus on this part of the world. Is this flurry of alliances that you're talking about going to be prodding the US perhaps to that direction of continuing to pay attention to East Asia or more attention?
Well, the flurry of partnerships that I mentioned aren't alliances. They're not commitments to some kind of security guarantee. What they are is partnerships to diversify trade, perhaps have a united diplomatic front in the United Nations Security Council or other international institutions to try and pull the United States back to a more positive direction, but at the same time, resist more assertive behavior from China, try to push the conflict in Ukraine to a peace settlement. And of course, all the countries are concerned about what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, how long the conflict will continue, and what will this mean for energy prices and their economies. They're trying to find creative ways to, again, insulate themselves from these pressures. But it's incredibly difficult. And as you mentioned, Japan and South Korea both want to ensure that the United States is focusing on the region. But as we've seen in the past, every time that the United States tries to focus on the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific or Asia, they get pulled back into some other part of the world, whether it's 9/11, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan. And they're trying to find creative ways to ensure that the Indo-Pacific region and their interests remain on the map for the United States. Fortunately, they do share tremendous amounts of national interest in terms of peace and stability in the region, enforcing some kind of international order based on rule of law. However, as we've seen with the attacks on Iran, the United States is now diplomatically focused on that part of the world, engaging in a conflict and trying to find ways to creatively end it as soon as possible.
Professor Nagy, always appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. Stephen Nagy there, Professor of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University. The U.S. has handed over a Chinese national suspected of drug-related crimes to China for the first time in recent years. The two countries do not have a formal extradition treaty. State news agency Xinhua says the individual, surnamed Han, is suspected of drug smuggling and trafficking. The suspect was handed over following leads provided by China's narcotics control authorities. No further details were given on the handover or the alleged crimes. The joint action comes ahead of U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to China in May. Mr. Trump has used tariffs to pressure China to clamp down on sellers of chemicals used to make fentanyl. And that's a deadly synthetic opioid, which is a leading cause of drug overdose deaths in the U.S. President Trump agreed to lower fentanyl-related tariffs last October during a meeting with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping in exchange for China's pledge to crack down on fentanyl networks. China's anti-graft watchdog is investigating Ma Xingwei, a member of the country's Politburo. This is according to state-run Xinhua news agency. Ma, who is being probed for, quote, serious violations of discipline and law, is the third member of the ruling party's elite body to face an investigation in the present term that began in 2022. Last year, Politburo member He Weidong was investigated and subsequently expelled from both the party and the military. Zhang Youxia, also a member, faced a probe. The 24-seat Politburo is now down to 21 members. We'll bring you more updates on Asia tonight. That's at 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time on that story. Cambodia's parliament has approved a sweeping new law targeting cybercrime as authorities move to crack down on the country's booming scam industry. The legislation approved by the Senate could see ringleaders of scam operations linked to human trafficking, detention and torture. And they could be jailed for up to 20 years and fines of as much as $500,000. They could also face life imprisonment if their actions result in death. The law specifically targets syndicates involved in online fraud schemes, including fake investment and romance schemes, many of which are run out of heavily guarded compounds across the region. Cambodia has come under international scrutiny in recent years, with authorities pledging to shut down all scam centres by the end of April. If you'd like to get more coverage on that topic, you can log on to cna.asia or our mobile app for stories such as the one you're seeing here on Cambodia extradition of an accused cyber scam boss to China. China has congratulated Myanmar's former military chief Min Aung Hlaing on his election as the country's next president.
中缅是传统友好邻邦和命运共同体，中国对缅友好政策面向全体缅甸人民。中方支持缅甸新政府维护国家和平稳定，实现发展繁荣。
Myanmar's House Speaker says Min Aung Hlaing received 429 out of the 584 votes cast by members of parliament, passing the majority threshold. The result follows a recent landslide election victory by an army-backed party. Western governments and critics condemned the poll, saying it was designed to entrench military rule under the guise of civilian governance. Min Aung Hlaing stepped down as military chief earlier this week, appointing a close ally as a successor. The former military chief led the 2021 coup that ousted Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi's government. Coming up on East Asia tonight, we take a look at the faces supporting China's EV boom as the country continues to dominate the global electric vehicle market. Welcome back. China has for more than a decade been the world's electric vehicle superpower. It's not only the world's largest market for EVs, but also the biggest producer, with homegrown companies such as BYD, NIO and XPeng emerging as major global players. Last year, EVs accounted for more than half of domestic car sales for the first time, with total production surpassing 16 million units. And that's up 29% on year, according to the China Association of Automobile Manufacturers. The city of Hefei in Anhui province has become one of the industry's key hubs. In 2024 alone, it produced nearly 1.4 million new energy vehicles, supported by an industry chain valued at more than $37 billion. Officials are not slowing down either. Plans are already in place to more than double the production capacity by 2027. But as China accelerates its manufacturing ambitions, a critical question emerges. Who will service all these new energy vehicles? Industry data is already highlighting a glaring issue. Of the roughly 4 billion auto repair workers in China, only 12% are qualified to handle the faults that most often occur in such vehicles. So as part of CNA's series on the forces powering electric vehicles in Asia, our digital correspondent Bong Xin-ying has been covering this development. She's joining me live from Shanghai. Bong, we heard that in China, electric vehicles are now accounting for more than half of all car sales. But your report takes us behind the shiny showrooms into the back. What did you find there?
Yeah, what you find when you get off the production line and into the workshops and showrooms is that China's EV revolution has two very different speeds. So the manufacturing side is moving at an extraordinary pace where there's nearly 44 million on the road, up from under 5 million in 2020. But the service workforce, the mechanics, the technicians, they are struggling to keep pace. There's official projections which put demand for the NEV service workers at 1.2 million by 2025, and the number who are actually trained to handle EV-specific systems is around 100,000, and that's a gap of more than 1 million people. So I chose to base the reporting in Hefei, Anhui province for a specific reason. Hefei is not just any Chinese city. It has become one of the country's most important EV hubs, and officials are targeting a 1 trillion yuan automotive cluster by 2027. So if the service workforce challenge is acute anywhere, it should be here. And what I've found is that even in a city swimming in EV investment, the after-sales ecosystem is being stitched together largely by individual initiative, by workers who saw the shift coming and made a calculated bet at their own expense. And I heard the same being expressed by two different technicians. Have a listen.
如果我们作为汽车后市场还没有敏觉到、嗅觉到咱们的新能源车的维修的这个机遇的话，有可能我们在这个行业前期的这些技术人员有可能将会被淘汰。
朋友介绍的，到那边培训班报了一个学习班嘛，大概的了解一下，后来也是靠自己慢慢摸索的。人家修你不能不修啊，你不修不就落伍了吗？
That instinct turned out to be right, and the way Zhao acted on it tells you a lot about how this workforce is actually being built. So he paid out of pocket to take his technicians to Shenzhen, Chongqing, and Hangzhou, cities with higher EV penetration rates and therefore more real repair experience to draw from. And he bought two EVs and dismantled them piece by piece so his team could understand what they were working with. And he has now trained close to 200 technicians and is renovating a 5-story, 6,000 square meter facility that's dedicated entirely to EV training and repair. But we all know that it's far from enough.
Yeah, definitely, because what you're describing to us is a massive skills gap. And from what you've been investigating, is it just a training problem or is it something more structural going on?
Yeah, it's actually both, and that's what makes this so difficult to solve. So even the workers who have done the training, they paid the fees, they put in the hours, they're running into walls that have nothing to do with their skill level. And the most striking example is battery repair. So many Chinese EV makers, they tightly control their access to technology, treating third-party battery repairs as an infringement of their company policy. So a skilled independent mechanic can be legally locked out of the highest value repair work, not because they can't do it, but it's by design. And there's also the EV price war, which is already killing weaker brands. So when a manufacturer goes under its proprietary systems, its part supply, they will disappear. So independent mechanics are left holding cars they literally cannot look up. So against all of that, there's a generation that's coming to this work for whom none of these barriers feel quite so daunting. Bao Shijie is one of them. He's 21. He's still enrolled in university and he's already working at Zhao Fei's workshop. So I asked him what drew him to this path in the first place.
因为对这个电子电路这方面比较感兴趣，不管是说汽车、油车还是新能源的，它那个汽车电路啊，都是比较感兴趣，所以选择这条道路。就是现在看到现在电动车比较普遍了吧，现在随处可见嘛。其实基本上现在很多家里面都是开始把传统油车抛弃了，反而去选择一个电动车，新能源。
But there's a significant distance between being drawn to something and being equipped to do it safely, because EV components can be potentially fatal if you're not careful with handling it. So Bao also described one moment at a workbench that encapsulates just how unforgiving that learning curve can be. Have a listen.
它电容就储存那个电的嘛，然后就是可能是哪里短路了，然后导致它那里就突然的电容就开始先是冒烟，冒烟之后就会炸，这会这电解液就会炸的这整个板子全部都是。你听到那个声音砰的一声，你心里面还是有点砰砰直跳，有点后怕了。
And Zhao Fei, who has built his entire second career around this work, is very clear about what it actually demands.
在这个行业里面，我认为最高尚的是一线的服务人员，特别是带有技术的服务人员，特别是像我们的技术人员。他要懂得原理，他要不断的试错，他要不断的尝试。随着一些这个技术的不断的剖析、了解之后、构想之后，然后你才能够解决这个问题。
So that constant learning is what distinguishes the workshops that are pulling ahead from those that are falling further behind. But it requires something that cannot be mandated from the top down, which is a genuine commitment to the work itself and not just to the commercial opportunity around it. And one analyst I spoke to told me that the frontline worker is the touch point for the brand. And in a price war where the margins are thin and every sale is hard won, if that person isn't trained and supported properly, the brands will end up losing the customer.
That is true. Now, I just wanted to ask a final question on an EV revolution of this magnitude. There are winners and losers. So who's gaining and who's being left behind?
Yeah, so the clearest winners are at the premium end of the market where the infrastructure investment is actually happening. And on the sales floor, the job has been transformed as well. A salesperson who spent years working for European brands before joining NEO, this local EV brand, told me that the conversation with customers has completely changed. So in traditional car sales, people have asked where to buy and where to service. And today, the customers, they want to talk about battery health, software updates, charging networks, the entire ownership experience. And he also told me that many of his former colleagues from classic foreign car brands have since made similar moves to domestic EV brands, which tells you something about where the industry's energy and opportunity have shifted as well. And that picture of an ecosystem still catching up is being captured by Yang Yi at Neo Manufacturing, who described how the school enterprise model works in practice. Here's what he said.
学校会给我们定向的输送一些人才，涉及到技师啊、操作人员的这些培养培训。当然，我们也会有工程师去到我们的这个院校去参与到联合的培养。
Now, on the other end, are people not switching to EV repairs? One car mechanic I spoke to is in her 50s, and she and her husband have been repairing petrol cars for nearly 30 years, and she's not transitioning. And her reasoning is this. She says every brand has its own proprietary diagnostic system, so investing in one could just take years to recoup. And with a customer base contracting, here's what she thinks things are heading.
学一学，你投资大了你不想去，你投资少的，花钱不多的，要想去学学也可以啊。那也可以就是这样能出来，但是进车太早了。辛苦的现在上就是进车一年比一年难，人家今年难，明年可能更难。
And here's the part that really gets said. The workers that's being asked to adapt may be adapting into a second cliff edge before they have finished crossing the first one. So this analyst I spoke to, he pointed out that you could probably get a robot to do the work within the next 3 or 4 years. So the simple routine service tasks that they may have provided a bridge for retraining workers. They are precisely the tasks that AI and robotics are coming for first. And we're looking at a workforce being asked to modernize at speed into a landscape that is itself about to shift again underneath them. So what her face shows you in microcosm is the full complexity of this moment.
All right, Bong, thank you so much for all the work you put into that story. Fascinating. CNE's digital correspondent Bong Xing Ying live from Shanghai. And that's this Friday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cne.asia. We're also on Facebook and YouTube. Bye-bye.